Thank you so much, everybody, for coming to our ISA item analysis and prep webinar. Julie and I will introduce ourselves here as well. So my name is Emily Miller. My pronouns are she, her. I was a high school chemistry teacher for 10 years. And during that time, I taught in our alternative learning program. I taught regular, I taught honors. So I had a lot of opportunities to teach a lot of different kids and try a lot of different strategies. I was an NGSS pioneer and advocate in my science department during my time there as well. And I was also a PLC lead. So I got to lead a lot of data-driven dialogue and data chats, which was super fun because I like data. And now I have the pleasure of partnering with districts in order to help them implement InnerOrbit into their school sites. And I kind of like savory more than sweet. Talking about Valentine's, like I was happy to get my chocolate. Like don't get me wrong, but I will always order an appetizer before dessert, like every single time. And Julia, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, I don't know about that take about ordering appetizers before dessert, but you do you. Some people like it. And thank you everyone for being here again. My name is Julia, and I was a teacher and a tutor for elementary students in the Dominican Republic for a long time. And now I've been supporting teachers and districts with their NGSS implementation for the past 3 years. My job is to partner and provide guidance to schools and districts implementing assessments in their NGSS instruction with InnerOrbit, specifically for the East Coast. And I think that matcha is better than coffee. I know that is, like a lot of people say, it tastes like grass. It's terrible. I love it, and you can't change my mind. And I would love to introduce you to what we're going to talk about today. Today we're going to model how to facilitate an item analysis PD session. So you're going to receive these slides later in case you actually want to facilitate the same session to your teachers or to the rest of your team, or if you just want to understand a little bit more about the ISA and how the questions are created. And we're going to help you better understand how these test items have shifted to sense making, how to use the SCPs, cross-cutting concepts, and assessments and phenomena in a unit to better prepare students for sense making tasks on the ISA. Now, for our agenda today, we're going to be here for about 45 minutes. We're going to start with identifying sense making by looking at some sample test items and then identifying what is representation and what is sense. Then we're going to talk about how to scaffold sense making. We're going to go into the ISA and what sense making looks like in the ISA. For that, we're going to understand what the NGSS are and then the 3 dimensions. Then we're going to go into an item analysis for 8th grade with the science and engineering practices and the cross-cutting concepts assessment tasks. Finally, we're going to talk about how to incorporate phenomena throughout a unit, and then we're going to wrap up. I am as excited as that little girl. So before we even start, I would love to introduce you to InnerOrbit in case you don't know what it is. And it's mainly 4 things. The first one is phenomena, for students to take what they learn in class and apply it to novel things they've never seen before. As you can see here, we have some exciting phenomena, some interesting phenomena, some beautiful turtles. And what we want to do is actually to have students taking that knowledge, those DCIs, those concepts, and applying to these novel scenarios, which at the end of the day is going to be what they have to do in the ISA. And it's what the NGSS is all about, for students to make sense of something novel. Next, we also have questions, and these questions are scaffolded. And Emily is going to talk a little bit about that, how questions are scaffolded in the site and how you can scaffold and build your own questions if you want to do that. But our questions build up in rigor. So we have 5 different types of questions that actually build up in rigor to those big 3-dimensional questions. Instead of just jumping into the performance expectation full rigor, we are actually building up with little stepping stones so that our students are not overwhelmed and that they can reach that performance a little bit better. We also have reports, and the great part of our reports is that you can not only see how students are struggling with this SCP or they're excelling with this DCI, you can see the specific element that you really need to focus and hone in on so you can make informed instructional decisions for your classroom and for your students, and so you can support your students in the way that they need, not necessarily just being blind and giving shots in the dark, but actually understanding what we really need to hone in on so that we can set students up for success with the NGSS. And finally, professional learning. And as you see, we have these sessions as the one that we are just having now rather frequently, but we also partner with our districts just to make sure we provide the professional learning that our teachers need. Very much specifically, we build sessions for them, and for the SCPs, we identify with the reports what are those needs for professional learning, and we just make sure that our teachers and our partners have the tools that they need in order to set students up for success. Now, Emily's going to drop a link in the chat before we talk about anything else. But this link in the chat will actually take you to her calendar in case you want to talk to her about maybe starting a pilot, trying out InnerOrbit. And that is it about InnerOrbit. Now we're going to talk about the ISA, but we wanted to give you a little introduction just for you to understand what InnerOrbit is. And now we're going to start discussing how there has been a shift towards sense making in state testing across different states. And I'm going to walk you through a phenomena that was in a recent NGSS end of year test, and we're going to consider the differences between these two questions. So one is a release test item for 2018, and the other one is a release test item from 2022. Now we're going to reflect on these differences between these two questions and understand why those differences are important for our instruction and assessment. The first question is asking, which of this is a biotic part of an ecosystem? Air, sunlight, cactus, or sand? The second question centers, we are observing a changing pond ecosystem from late August to early September. And we ask students that based on the information, they need to explain how resource availability affects population in the pond between late August and late September. And they should include explanations of how during each of the two time periods, the plant population is affected by resource availability and the fish population is affected by resource availability. Now, as we're here, I would love if you could write it down in the Zoom chat. Please make sure you send your messages to everyone because we would love it if everyone can see what you've been sending. If you can see what is the difference between these two questions, and then extra points if you can tell us why that difference is important for instruction and assessment practices. We're going to give you a minute for you to think about that and drop your answers in the chat. Okay, so Amy is saying that there's greater depth of knowledge shown in number 2. And this mimics what we want in our classroom instruction and assessment practices to be. And this is so important. She said, not just recall. Really interesting. And if you're still typing out your response, please keep doing so. But we're going to, just for the sake of time, we're going to keep moving on. And for that, we want to highlight what the difference between sense making and representation is, as Amy just mentioned before. So when we talk about representation, we refer to how students communicate their understanding of concepts they've already been taught. So this could be through diagrams, written explanations, or oral presentations even. It's about expressing what they know. And the first question perfectly assesses students' ability to identify an abiotic factor. This is useful for diagnostic assessments because this is where we gauge students' pre-existing knowledge and formative assessment too, because this is where we monitor learning progress and provide feedback. However, while representation or recall is crucial for developing understanding and tracking learning progress, it doesn't fully demonstrate a student's ability to apply their knowledge in new, unfamiliar contexts. Now, we talk about sense making. That's a whole other thing, right? On the other hand, it involves deeper cognitive processes. So it's about students engaging with new phenomena, and this is important. Phenomena has to be novel for it to be sense making, and using their knowledge and skills to explain why or how something happens. And this is where they apply what they learn in novel situations. Now, sense making is best suited for summative assessments, which evaluate student learning at the end of an instructional period and are designed to measure whether students have achieved the learning objectives and if they're ready to meet the performance expectation. And the ultimate goal of the NDSS at the end of the day is for students to demonstrate mastery of the standard through sense making. So this means that they can apply cross-cutting concepts, science and engineering practices, and disciplinary core ideas, the DCIs, to understand and explain new phenomena. So in summary, both representation and sense making are vital components of science education, but representation helps us understand what students know, just that, and supports their learning development, but sense making allows us to assess their deeper understanding and mastery of scientific concepts. So by effectively integrating these two into our teaching practices, we can ensure a more comprehensive and robust science education for our students. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about scaffolding up to sense making because it is complicated to get students just from representation to that. Now, let's see how NGSS is interwoven within this practice, as well as how we can scaffold our students to master sense making. And now let's take a look at the 3 dimensions of the NGSS and how they come together to support sense making. As I just said before, first, we have the disciplinary core ideas, or DCIs. And these are the big ideas of science, the foundational concepts that students need to understand, like energy transfer ecosystems or forces in motion. So when we're talking about recall, when we're talking about representation, this is all there is, DCIs, and that's it. Next, we have our science and engineering practices, or SEPs. And these are the skills students use to do science. So this is what students do, like analyze data, constructing explanations and designing solutions, developing and using models. These SEPs are all about engaging students in the process of figuring things out. And finally, our cross-cutting concepts, or CCCs. And these are the themes that run across all areas of science, like patterns, cause and effect, system and models. And these help students make connections between different disciplines and apply their learning in new contexts. Now, these dimensions come together, and that's what makes the NGSS unique. These dimensions come together when students engage with a novel phenomenon. For example, if students are investigating why certain plants grow better in one environment than the other, they might use DCIs about ecosystems, SEPs to analyze environmental data, and then cross-cutting concepts like cause and effect to explain their findings. So this integration of all 3 dimensions pushes students beyond just memorizing facts, and it invites them to make sense of the world, or as we identified earlier, sense making. And this is the heart of both the NGSS and what they're going to have to do in the ISA. And now, how do we move from a single dimensional focus on content knowledge to true 3-dimensional sense making? So on the left, we have the column labeled DCI only that represents a 1-dimensional questions, just recall. And this is where students are being asked to demonstrate their knowledge or of content or a disciplinary core idea without integrating the other dimensions, like the question we saw before about abiotic factors. Then to help students develop deeper understanding, we can leverage science and engineering practices and cross-cutting concepts alongside the DCI. By integrating SEPs and cross-cutting concepts into the learning process, we create 2-dimensional tasks that require students to engage more actively with the material. Then to take it a step further, we introduce novel phenomena, real-world situations or problems that students haven't encountered before, to provide context for students to apply what they know, use their science and engineering skills, and connect ideas across disciplines. And this process allows us to gradually scaffold their understandings and skills so that they can tackle 3-dimensional sense-making questions. And these are the types of questions that students synthesize the DCIs, the SEPs, and cross-cutting concepts. And in the next part of the webinar, we'll break down what the ISA looks like. So by starting with content and layering in skills and concepts, we're setting up students for success, not just in assessments like the ISA, but also in their ability to think like scientists and engineers in the world. Now, I'm going to pass it over to Emily to talk about the items that we've seen on the ISA and how they're 3-dimensional.
All right. Thank you so much, Julia, for that introduction. Regardless of how comfortable you are with the NGSS, it's always nice just to get that little reminder of what those dimensions are and the purpose behind them in order to eventually get to that sense-making goal. So in light of that, I want to talk a little bit about the performance expectations that the ISA will reference when they're writing their items. So performance expectations, another way to think about them are like the standards of the NGSS. So I've got an example of one here for ESS 2.2. So this is a 4th grade standard. ESS is Earth and Space Science, and 2.2 is like the 2nd domain and then the 2nd standard. And this is reading to analyze and interpret data from maps to describe patterns of Earth's features. So when we're looking at this performance expectation, we're going to see the 3 different dimensions coming into play. The first being the SEP. So what students need to be able to do is to analyze and interpret data. They need to do this with the content, which is going to be looking at plate tectonics and Earth's features through the lens of the cross-cutting concept, which is patterns. So if you look at that for ESS 2.2 statement there, you can kind of see how each one of these dimensions kind of takes a part in that whole broad standard and how they all come together there. So when ISA item writers are coming together to write these assessment items, they're going to be referencing one of these performance expectations. And when they're looking at this performance expectation, they can essentially write 3 different types of questions. They can do a 1-dimensional, DCI only question, which would be like a recall or representation question that Julia was talking about. They could write a two-dimensional question, which is going to be taking the DCI and layering the CCC on top of it. So can you use the content through the lens of patterns? Or they could do a two-dimensional question using the content and the SCP, like analyzing, interpreting data. Or they can finally write a three-dimensional question, which is going to be bringing all three of these concepts together into one question. So when we're looking at the ISA, they are going to be looking at these different standards from all three content areas, so Earth and Space Science, Life Science, and Physical Science, and they're going to be referencing these performance expectations when writing their items. What I have here is a blueprint for the fifth grade ISA. So when you're looking at this, you're going to notice we've got all of these different performance expectations listed. And then from there, it also highlights the three different dimensions. So it highlights the specific SEPs that will be assessed within the fifth grade ISA, the specific cross-cutting concepts, and then the DCIs are embedded there within the performance expectations. So as you can see, students are going to be asked to bring a lot together in order to answer these questions. And in fact, a majority of the ISA is going to be two-dimensional and three-dimensional questions. So not just recall questions, but they're going to need to be taking what they know and then layering on the skills and the cross-cutting concepts on top of it. So to kind of show you how this actually comes into play, I have an 8th grade ISA item that we're going to go ahead and analyze here together. I got this from the 8th grade ISA practice test. And the performance expectation that this ISA item is referencing is MS-ELIS 4.1. So students are going to be asked to analyze and interpret data for patterns in the fossil record that document the existence, diversity, extinction, and change of life forms throughout the history of life on Earth under the assumption that natural laws operate today as they do in the past. Oof. So when we're looking at that performance expectation, these are the three different dimensions that are playing into it. First is the SEP of analyzing, interpreting data. So students are going to have to be able to do this skill in order to answer the assessment item we're about to look at. The DCI, or the content they're going to have to be referencing, is this idea of fossil records and how fossils are placed within different sedimentary rock layers and what that tells us about the time period that that fossil existed. And then the last is the cross-cutting concept, and they're going to have to be able to identify and notice patterns while looking at images and graphs and charts. So students are going to be asked to do all three of these dimensions in order to answer this item here. So the first thing I want us to look at is the phenomenon that is going to be involved with the item. So this phenomena involves finding various fossils within different layers of the Grand Canyon. Figure 1 depicts the 4 different fossil types found. They've labeled them W, X, Y, and Z. And they gave the age of these fossils in millions of years ago. That's what the MYA stands for. And then figure 2 shows the various layers in the rock canyon, including the Coconino sandstone layer that formed 280 million years ago. So this is the phenomena that students were presented with this item. And then this is the question that is being asked of them. So students need to describe the location of the fossils relative to the Coconino sandstone layer, and they have to choose the option that correctly completes the description. So the first one is fossil X is likely found, and then what they can choose is in a layer above or in a layer below the Coconino sandstone. And fossil Y is likely found in a layer above or in a layer below the same Coconino sandstone. And then the last question they're being asked is, the fossil likely found in the topmost rock layer is either fossil W, X, Y, and Z. So, sense-making question right here. We have our novel phenomena, these fossils within the Grand Canyon, and now we need to bring in all three dimensions of the performance expectation to answer it. So let's take a look and see how those three different dimensions actually play into this question. The first one that I want us to look at is going to be the SEP, which is analyzing and interpreting data. So students are going to be asked to analyze and interpret data, and specifically they're going to be looking for similarities and differences in the findings. So in order to answer this question correctly, students need to be able to leverage this SEP. And the main way they're doing it in this item is they need to be able to look at the data given in figure 1, which is how old these fossils are. And then they need to also look at how old the Coconino sandstone layer is as well. So between this, they're going to be looking for the similarities and differences in findings as far as the age of the fossils compared to the sandstone. So are they similar? Are they different? Are they older? Are they younger? So this is how students are going to need to analyze and interpret data in order to answer this question correctly. Then for the DCI, students are going to need to understand how the placement of fossils within the layers communicates the fossil record. Essentially, how old that fossil is or what that animal was, what time period it lived in, etc. This content is, the DCI is taking place in this question, kind of in this last part here, where students are being asked the fossil that is likely found in the topmost rock layer is either W, X, Y, or Z. So in order to answer this question, students have to have the content knowledge that younger fossils would be in layers closer to the surface, and older fossils would be in layers lower in the surface, because these layers are slowly building out on top over time. So that is where students need to have that content information to be able to answer this. The last element of the performance expectation, the last dimension that students will need to pull on is the CCC, which is patterns. And the patterns really play in when students need to answer these questions in a layer above or in a layer below. So students have to notice the pattern of where fossils will lie in corresponds to that Coconino sandstone. So the patterns of, okay, the younger ones are on top and the older ones are going to be below that 280 millions of years ago. All right. So this is what students are going to be asked to do on the ISA. And this is just one example, one item from the 8th grade test. So what can we do to help students be able to answer this question? How can we help students layer in all of these different dimensions in order to answer these tricky 3-dimensional sense-making questions? The first thing that we're going to suggest here is really leveraging the SCPs and the CCCs into your assessment items that you're giving to students. So we as teachers, especially as science teachers, we know the stuff, right? Like we know our chemistry, we know our biology, we have this information, and we're really good at communicating this information to our students. And we're also really good at these SCPs and these CCCs. But being purposeful with how we're incorporating that into our assessments ensures that students are getting a chance to actually practice these dimensions as well. So we are looked into a tool that was offered by STEM Teaching Tools, and this actually provided guidance on designing tasks that emphasize specific dimensions. In this case, specifically the SCP. So when you create tasks using the STEM teaching tools, you're essentially creating these 2-dimensional questions. So you're layering on the SCP with the DCI. So just as a reminder, the SCP for that specific item was analyzing and interpreting data. So a way that we could create a question that is specifically helping students to analyze and interpret data is by looking at this prompt from STEM Teaching Tools, which is present students with a scenario that describes an investigation, the phenomenon under investigation, multiple recorded observations from the investigation, and the results of analyses. Then we're going to ask students to use the results to explain the phenomena. By having students do this, you're really having them dig into analyzing and interpreting that data. So I'm going to show you an example now of a question on InnerOrbit that uses this STEM teaching tools and creates a 2-dimensional question so you could see what this would look like. So the phenomenon that was used for this assessment item is looking at a fossil, and in this case, it's an ammonite fossil. And using this task, the question that we can create is this. Referring to figure 1, between the rock layer model and the fossil record, determine which of the following is true about ammonite fossils. So I'm prompting students here to analyze and interpret the data that is within the figure, and they need to be able to do that to answer this question. To show you what the answer options look like, I'll go ahead and click through here. I just wanted to give you a moment to actually see the phenomena in all of its glory before I cover it up with the question. But asking students to really dig into that image, read the data, look at the dates, as having them practice that skill of analyzing and interpreting data, which is going to be the SCP that students are going to need to leverage. So that's an example of how you can create a 2-dimensional question with the SCP. Now I want to talk about how you can create a two-dimensional question, but with the CCC. So STEM Teaching Tools has created another article also about how to leverage another part of the performance expectation dimensions, but this time it's the CCC. So how can you layer the cross-cutting concept on top of the content? So just to remind you, the cross-cutting concept we looked at in that assessment item was patterns. So one of the prompts that you can give students in an assessment item is you can ask them after presenting the students with observational data as part of the scenario. You can ask, does the pattern of the data you see allow you to conclude about? So it's specifically having them try to identify the patterns that could be found within the data. So an example of a question that highlights this, and again, I'm using the exact same phenomena as before, so the ammonites. Our question is, to see figure 2, explain what patterns you notice in the ammonite fossil data. So this one isn't just having them look at data, but it's having them try to identify the patterns within the data. So before they were just analyzing and interpreting the data and trying to disseminate information from it. Now we're trying to identify the patterns within it. So as you give students these two-dimensional questions, what you're essentially doing is you're helping them slowly build those skills to eventually bring them all together in order to answer a three-dimensional sense-making question. So this bottom question is kind of like if I took these two top questions and smushed them together into a three-dimensional question. So students need to analyze and interpret data. So they need to look at data from the figure in order to understand the patterns of the ammonite population over time. So this is still referencing that phenomena from before about the ammonites. So the more and more practice we give with students answering two-dimensional questions, we can then kind of slowly scaffold how students could then combine them in order to answer a three-dimensional question. So now that we talked a little bit about assessment items and the different types of assessment items and how you can leverage the SEPs and the CCCs, now I wanted to talk a little bit about a practical way that you can incorporate novel phenomena within a unit. So again, in order to get them to this three-dimensional sense making, we need to be able to leverage the SEPs and CCCs, but students also have to experience novel phenomena at the same time. If you don't give students opportunities to make sense of novel phenomena, you're truly not giving them chances to actually practice sense making, which is what the ISA is going to be having them doing. So in order to talk about this, I wanted to pull up specifically a unit from OpenSciEd. So this can be done with any science curriculum, any NGSS aligned science curriculum. I just picked OpenSciEd to give like a practical, tangible example, but please know that this can be done with any unit of any curriculum. So in this specific unit of OpenSciEd, the 4 standards that are being taught within the unit are listed here. So I'm going to talk about a practical way to incorporate novel phenomena throughout a unit, specifically when MSLS 2.3 is being taught. So just to remind you really quick what MSLS 2.3 is, it is to develop a model to describe the cycling of matter and flow of energy among living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. So when you're teaching a unit, and generally an NGSS aligned unit like OpenSciEd or Amplify, a lot of these units are now beginning with some form of anchoring phenomena. And the idea of this anchoring phenomena is to kind of give students something they can keep connecting back to while learning these skills. For example, in this OpenSciEd unit, the anchoring phenomena is maple syrup. So this idea that you can like put a spigot in a tree and maple syrup comes out of it. And what the anchoring phenomena gives a really nice opportunity for teachers to do is to model sense making to students. So you can keep coming back to maple syrup and you can prompt their ideas around this cycling of matter. So like, where did that maple syrup come from? What does it do in the body? How was it made in the tree? And as you're talking about these various skills, you can model the sense making activity to maple syrup. Now, after you talk about maple syrup, you're going to do some lessons, right? So you're going to do your direct instruction, you're going to do your labs, you're going to do your activities that are centered around this concept of MSLS 2.3. And notice these are lessons 12, 13, and 14. So this would be like near the end of the unit because that's when MSLS 2.3 is being taught in this OpenSciEd unit. And what we're suggesting is once you've taught a few lessons that all center around one performance expectation, we think you should pause and give a scaffolded formative assessment on a new phenomena. So I pulled actually an example from InnerOrbit to kind of show you what this could look like. So InnerOrbit has a cluster of questions titled, "What's the scoop with worm poop?" And as you can see, that has nothing to do with maple syrup. But the questions within this cluster all relate back to LS2-3 and would all relate back to the modeling of sense making that was done with maple syrup. But now you're giving students a chance to apply what they've learned to something entirely new, which in this case is worm poop. And what's nice about pausing your instruction after teaching students and doing a scaffolded formative like this on a new phenomena is it's going to give you some really awesome data to figure out what you might need to go back and revisit. So do I need to look back at the SEP? Do I need to look back at the CCC? And what's needs to be really clear with the scaffolded formative is this should have one-dimensional, two-dimensional, and three-dimensional questions on it, because then you can really parse out where students need more support. And the data on InnerOrbit actually tells you specifically how they're doing on the DCIs, the SEPs, and the CCCs, which is really nice. And then after you've given this mid-unit cluster on a brand new phenomena, you do want to still save a completely different phenomena for your summative at the end. In this case, how does the savanna survive the dry seasons? Because again, if you really want to know if students have mastered the concepts that you've been teaching, you need to give them an opportunity to engage in sense making. And to engage in sense making, they have to be looking at something new. So while anchoring phenomena within units are an awesome way to model sense making, you do want to find different phenomena that you can pull from to do formative and summative assessments in order to really see how students are doing with that sense making concept. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Julia to wrap us up. And we're even ending a little early. Look at us.
We've done so much today in a little under 40 minutes, which is amazing. We've identified sense making, talked about sample test items. We've talked about how to scaffold sense making, some items of the ISA, an item analysis from 8th grade. We've talked about incorporating phenomena in a unit, and we're now wrapping up. If you want to chat with us about a free pilot, or if you're interested in understanding a little bit more how InnerOrbit works, Emily just dropped a link to her calendar. So if you just want to find some time in her calendar to learn more about InnerOrbit, that would be great. If you like social media and you would love to see a little bit, if you like the content that we are sharing with you right now, you can always follow us on social, on Twitter at InnerOrbit.edu, or on X actually now, and on Instagram, Facebook, etc. InnerOrbit and GSS. And on our YouTube channel, we always upload these videos, like webinars that we host. If you're interested in learning more about test prep, learning more about the 3 dimensions, learning a little bit more about the NGSS, we have a bunch of videos there that you, if they're helpful, you can watch. And if you have feedback or if you have any questions, you can always email us at inquiries@innerorbit.com. And we are so thankful for you being here in this cold, cold day in Illinois. And we really expect to see you or talk to you very, very soon. Thank you so much for being here and for joining us up until the very, very end.